Welcome to Honcho on the Air, a podcast that brings you the latest talks and the latest trends in business, technology, innovation, and the candid side of C-level executives. Each week on this season, we explore topics and issues on human resources, management, leadership, HR technology, recruiting, talent management, organizational culture, and strategic HR.
Honcho on the Air is sponsored by Aces Business. Trust the expert. Now back to the show.
Our guest today is Noel Quantilla. He is the HR Director of ADP Philippines Incorporated with expertise on employee relations, human resources, and employee management. He is going to talk to us about the 4-day work week and other flexible work arrangements under the new normal. So let's talk about the 4-day work week. Is this something new?
Week is actually not new. In fact, the first guidelines on the compressed work week started way back in the 1990s during the oil crisis. It was really brought about by the oil crisis at the time, and the Department of Labor issued the DO02190. So this is the first formal description or guidance on the implementation of the compressed work week. Now, over time, it somehow developed into more workplace arrangements, simply from compressed work week to more types of flexible arrangements, gliding or changing work hours, flexi holidays, and so on and so forth. And during the other crisis, in the energy crisis of 2004, they reissued the same guidelines. And then back in 2009, during the financial crisis, they also reissued the same guidelines with more addition that is specific to BPO, allowing to work at night. So previously, it was not permitted. So there were a lot of changes. And recently, in last year, to address COVID situations, they again reissued these guidelines. But I think for me, the compressed work week is really a step 200 years back into the first industrial revolution. So we're talking about the conditions where workers work very long hours with the time, no breaks, and so on and so forth. So to me, that's the one thing that can be said about the compressed work week.
Okay, so Noel, you mentioned flexible arrangements in the workplace. What are these exactly? Can you tell us more about this?
Yeah, so aside from the compressed work week, which is simply the reduction of work day to say 4 from 5 or 6 from 5 from 6 or 4 from 5. So depending on the standard work week in an establishment, but the number of hours are still the same. So if it's 48 in a week or 40 in a week, it's the same. So in a given day, you can be working about 11 hours or 10 hours. So from the usual 8 hours. So that's one. The other two is the gliding or flexi time, where you have core business hours where you have to be present. But other than those hours, you can decide, or the worker can decide when to arrive or when to leave the workplace. So that's one type also. The other is flexi holiday. And this flexi holiday is mostly used in the BPO where the workers are using holidays overseas. Like, for example, if there's a holiday in the US or Canada or elsewhere, they tend to have no work during that time, but it's not a holiday here in the Philippines. Mm-hmm. So what happens is that you use those holidays to compensate for the other holidays where you have to work. Like sometimes it's Christmas, New Year, or Independence Day. So those are not holidays in the countries where they provide service. So they work during those days. So in the end, it's a net 0-0 compensation. So if you work during the US holidays, you get the premiums for the local holidays that exchange for those holidays. And there are other, like early lunch or reduced meal breaks. So it's really a lot of ways to do flexible work arrangement, but the condition really is it must be voluntary, and that it should not result to a reduction in the benefits of the.
So are flexible arrangements responsive to workplace needs during the pandemic?
Yes, I think some of the flexible work arrangements are not only necessary but also helpful in addressing the situation that we're in now. So most, if not all, are working from home. So I think at this point, 90% of the workforce are still working from home since there is still issues on the vaccines and transportation and so on. So the health protocols. But the specific work arrangements that were introduced during the COVID period is really the one that reduces some of the burden from the employers, like the reduction of work days or work hours. So it necessarily results to reduced paid time. So if you were working like 40 hours and it's reduced to 30, then you lose the pay for the 10 hours. That's the situation during the pandemic. And then there's also the rotation, since our protocol limits on the number of associates or employees who are allowed to report to the office or to the factories. People have to rotate. If you're working 5 days, now you're working like every other day, so that you also give the chance for other employees to work. So again, you lose your earning capacity for those days that you're not working. And then there are forced leaves, or some companies call them furloughs, and broken time. So these are, I think, coping up measures for mostly for the companies to remain operational or viable, and at the same time, it helps in securing or saving the employment of the workers. So these are, we can say, the bitter pill to swallow this time.
I understand. Now, the 4-day work week, going back to that, you mentioned earlier, what are the advantages?
So the advantages are also many. You have more days off. So you have more, shall we say, quality time for leisure or family. And then some would say that there are more days or time that is bigger chunk to recover from fatigue. And then there's also, for the companies, reduced absenteeism. So just imagine reducing the work week would result to about 25% reduction in absenteeism, because if one is absent in one of the 4 days, then he is not only absent for 1 day, but for 1 4 day. So people would avoid that, particularly the whimsical absences. And then, of course, there's also reduced commuting time. So instead of commuting 5 days or 6 days a week, you just commute 4 days or 5 days. So those are the, shall we say, the obvious advantages.
Mm-hmm. And it keeps some employees happy. They get to have the 3-day weekend, like you said, have some quality time for themselves and their family. But now, as this 4-day work week, it appeals globally. Some countries have already applied it, and now with the pandemic, many companies have also applied it. In your opinion, is it healthy to work for 10 hours a day?
Well, yeah, so that's the thing. Like I mentioned, we're going back to in that first industrial revolution, where the situation is this characterized as working very long hours and during the day. And I think that the most disadvantageous outcome of the prolonged workday is health, like a degradation of the health of the workers. So this develops not immediately, but over time, and there are certain studies that indicate fatigue, for example, and alertness of the longer time off at the end of the week can only compensate for those who are maintaining healthy and good sleep patterns. Like, so if you're able to compensate the longer work hours with sufficient sleep, then that's possible. But over time, if it's unchecked, the longer work days are detrimental to health. And that's precisely why I think the guidelines would put limits. Like in the current guidelines, the limit for flexible work arrangement, particularly the compressed work week, is about 6 months. So beyond that, you have to secure further approvals. And there are also types of workers who are not usually allowed to do compressed work week, like those in construction, in health services. Although that's arguable, because one of the sector who's really working very long hours are the health workers. But they are supposed to be not part of that. Those who are also doing heavy manual labor, those who are exposed to the elements, the substances, chemicals, carcinogens, so those, and even noise. So those workers who are exposed to those situations are not supposed to be covered by precisely because of the health effect of that.
Mhm.
So I guess the drawback is really long term. We might not see it today, but sometime in the future, these things might exhibit or become more obvious.
Honcho on the Air is sponsored by Globe Labs. Redefine possibilities. Like what you hear so far? Make sure you never miss a show by clicking the follow button now. This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. Thank you for your support. Now back to the show.
You mentioned the pros and cons of having a 4-day work week and how it could affect the health of an employee, while also depending on the type of job that they have. What are the other drawbacks for a 4-day work week in an organization?
So it also increases the chances of accidents and injuries because certain workers in manufacturing, for example, they can become overly tired over the day, and they start to lose focus and concentration, and so it enhances or increases the risk of accidents and injuries in the workplace. And so far, there are no real studies on how these are quantified, but the accidents are really inevitable when you have workers whose condition is resulting to reduced mental and physical capacity, impairing their judgment and concentration, even reaction to situation, and the increased risk-taking behavior. So when you are really too tired, you tend to just say, let's just do it or let's get done with it, probably cutting corners and thereby missing some of the health protocols, standards that can prevent accidents.
Would there be any advice from you if an organization or a company is thinking about changing or shifting to a 4-day work week for their employees? Are there any steps that they need to do before they make the transition?
I think the first and foremost is to assess whether the situation will be conducive for longer work days. In some areas, in other countries, they reduced the work week, but they did not increase the work days, the number of hours in a day. So those are the ideal countries. We can talk about them later. But if an organization, if a company is looking at imposing or adopting the longer work days, then they should assess whether the types of work, the functions that are being carried out are conducive to longer work days. And then they should also assess the specific or the individual situations of workers. For example, gender, parental status, marital status, age, even age, can dictate that the capacity or the adaptability of a worker to a longer work. Studies shown that those with major outside work responsibilities like single parents or those who have to take care of someone outside work, it is very disadvantageous for them because the people that they care for cannot wait for them longer. They have to spend time every day to do all these things. It has to be some sort of balance. And in doing that, the companies are also assessing because, as I mentioned earlier, it's voluntary. How many are going to volunteer and so on. And so when all these things are taken into account, then companies can more or less make informed judgment on whether compressed work week or longer work days would work for them.
Mhm. Aside from assessment, would you recommend or have some companies and organization um, have they done maybe a dry run or a temporary run for a few months before implementing a 4-day work week? Is this a practice that companies do, or is this something that you would suggest?
Yes, it is very advisable. In fact, in some of the organizations that I've been with, when we did the compressed work week, we did it on a gradual basis. Start first 2 months and then 3 months, so we can extend it until we find the right cadence. And I think there's also the need to educate. So you have to train and to inform your workers onto the pros and cons or mitigating circumstances that they should observe, the observance of health and safety protocols. So I think those components are very crucial. Gradual implementation, observation monitoring, and at the same time educating the workers.
Mhm. Okay, due to the COVID and the work from home situation, many agree that flexibility and productivity can go hand in hand. Can you share some key success factors that companies, managers, and employees need to keep top of mind as we navigate new ways of working?
Oh, yes. So all of us, I think, or most of us are really impacted by the lockdowns. And so we're working from home. So there are a lot of advantages, but there are also things that are very worrisome. You start to lose the team dynamics. Companies would probably benefit from doing a lot of virtual education in terms of managing virtually, even conducting meetings virtually, how to connect with your workers. For example, in our case, what we did when the lockdown was announced was to activate, since the most effective channel is social media. So we created a private chat group that we invited all our employees to participate, and then we created content. So over time, we had a consistent engagement with them because we don't want to lose touch with our associates. They would participate. And in fact, we have hundreds of thousands of reactions and posts. And so it's very active. And I think we were more engaged during the pandemic than previously because of that. I think because there is a need for us to really socialize and be part of a larger community rather than the confines of our homes. So it gives us a sem freedom and mobility, although we're just sitting little corner in the house. So you can imagine not many people have big space and that are conducive to work at home. So you have dogs, you have family members, you have all sorts of distractions. So we have to live with that, and compounded with the longer hours. And I think what was found out during the pandemic was employees who are working from home are clocking in longer time than they were during the pre-COVID. Because you have the tendency to lose track of time. Like since you're just sitting there in your bed or in your dining table as I'm doing it now, you don't log off until you see everybody's out. And in many situations, people are still there, so they're waiting for one another to log out. So, in fact, I think there was a move somewhere, I don't know if it's in Congress, where they are saying that workers have the right to disconnect after their work time. Although I think it's not necessarily legislation because it's the people who are not disconnecting voluntarily because they want to be connected. That's one, I think, unique situation that we're in.
Okay, yeah, very interesting times we are in these days, right? Noel? So, is there anything else you'd like to add for before we leave, before we go?
I think what I can suggest is for all of us, companies and employees alike, to be conscious of our situation. I think the most important is to look after our health, and that health includes our mental well-being. So there are a lot of signs we're developing mental health issues because of our situation. And the longer work days that we are doing is not helping any. So in fact, there was a study that said that working more than 10 or 11 hours a day increases the likelihood to develop depression by 2.5 times, so 250%, and 60 times more in developing heart ailments. So those are very serious, I think, serious matters. They are not very obvious. We probably don't realize them until it's there. And in our case, for example, we have seen not too few issues where our associates are experiencing and complaining about their feeling of depression and then the need to seek help. So one of the facilities that would probably benefit companies or organization is a helpline. So I know there are many public helplines, but those are really specific to prevention of suicide. I think there is a need for helplines that really tackle the overall mental health. Like you can just ask, I'm feeling very lonely these few days. What can I do? So it doesn't necessarily need to be the extremes where I want to kill myself before I call this hotline. So these are very, I think, helpful in our situation. We deputize our team members to reach out, to connect, sometimes even to visit physically. Those with extreme, when we sense that there's an extreme situation, we visit so that we can really assess whether we need to escalate to a higher level of support, maybe refer to a counselor or something. So those are, I think, little things that can mean a lot and can prevent a lot of problems in the long run. So,
I agree. Yes, it's basically addressing the stresses that we are dealing with in these times, very challenging and new times. And that was great. Thank you so much for talking to us. This was a very insightful conversation, Noel. And
you,
hope to
Claire.
see you again in the future. Thank you for joining us this week on Honcho on the Air. Make sure to visit our website at cnhr.org, where you can subscribe to us on Spotify so you'll never miss a show. And while you're at it, make sure to like and subscribe to our social media pages to get the latest news and updates. Thanks for joining us today. Till next week.